There is something deeply unsettling about watching a person spend their entire life constructing an image they cannot truly live inside. The narcissist is often admired from a distance because appearances are their greatest craft. They learn early how to project strength without humility, confidence without wisdom, and charm without sincerity. To the outside world, they can appear untouchable. Yet one of the first signs that God's judgment is already unfolding is not public humiliation or immediate destruction. It is the silent collapse taking place behind the mask. Most people imagine judgment as something dramatic, lightning from the sky, instant consequences, visible downfall. But spiritual judgment is often quieter than that. It begins internally. It begins in the hidden architecture of the soul. A person can still possess money, influence, beauty, followers, or authority, while inwardly becoming more fragmented by the day. In many ways, that is the most terrifying form of judgment. And because no audience can rescue you from yourself. The narcissist depends entirely on external validation to maintain an unstable inner world. Praise becomes emotional oxygen. Admiration becomes survival. Control becomes security. But the human soul was never designed to live on performance alone. When a person spends years manipulating others, avoiding accountability, and feeding an inflated self-image, they gradually lose contact with reality itself. They may still speak with certainty, but internally there is confusion. They may still appear confident, but underneath the confidence is panic, the panic of someone desperately trying to outrun emptiness. And this is where the collapse begins. At first it appears as restlessness. They cannot sit alone in silence because silence forces confrontation with the self they have spent years escaping. Then comes irritation and chronic dissatisfaction. Nothing feels sufficient for long. Attention fades too quickly. Compliments lose their effect. Achievements bring only temporary relief. The narcissist keeps demanding more from the world because internally they are becoming less capable of feeling whole. What makes this especially tragic is that many narcissists mistake this inner decay for everyone else's failure. They believe people are becoming ungrateful, disloyal, difficult, or weak. Rarely do they stop to consider that the growing emptiness inside them may be the consequence of living disconnected from truth. A soul cannot survive indefinitely on illusion. Eventually, reality begins collecting its debt. This is why many narcissists become increasingly paranoid with time. They begin suspecting betrayal everywhere. They obsess over criticism. They overreact to small disagreements. Why? Because maintaining a false self requires constant protection. Deep down, they know the image is fragile. And when a person worships their own image, every threat to that image feels catastrophic. Ironically, the stronger they appear externally, the weaker they often become internally. Their relationships lose depth because authenticity would expose vulnerability. Their achievements lose meaning because achievement without inner peace eventually feels hollow. Even moments of victory are haunted by fear of losing control, losing admiration, losing status, losing power. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs of God's judgment. The narcissist slowly becomes trapped inside the very identity they created. The mask no longer protects them, it imprisons them. There is a profound difference between confidence rooted in truth and confidence rooted in ego. One produces peace, the other produces exhaustion. A person aligned with truth does not need to constantly defend themselves against the world. But the narcissist lives in perpetual defense because falsehood always requires maintenance. The soul was not created to carry that burden forever. Over time, this hidden collapse begins leaking into every part of life. Emotional instability increases. Rage becomes more frequent. Relationships become more transactional. Their ability to genuinely love diminishes because authentic love requires humility, and humility threatens the narcissistic illusion. What remains is a person who may possess many things externally while internally becoming spiritually starved. And the tragedy is this. Many people envy them without realizing they are witnessing someone already unraveling from within. Because God's judgment does not always begin with the removal of possessions. Sometimes it begins with the removal of peace, and there is no greater poverty than a soul that has everything except rest. One of the most revealing aspects of silent judgment is that it rarely announces itself all at once. It unfolds gradually, almost invisibly at first, through the slow deterioration of human connection. And this is especially significant in the life of the narcissist, because narcissism depends heavily on the AB. ability to extract emotional energy, admiration, loyalty, and attention from other people. Relationships are not experienced as sacred bonds to be nurtured. They are often treated as mirrors designed to reflect importance back to the self. For a time, this strategy can appear successful. The narcissist may surround themselves with admirers, followers, friends, romantic partners, or even family members who reinforce their sense of superiority. They may seem socially powerful, influential, even beloved, but there is a problem hidden beneath all of it. Relationships built on manipulation cannot produce genuine intimacy. They can produce dependency, fear, obligation, or fascination, but not real trust. And eventually, truth begins to surface. One of the quiet ways God exposes deception is by allowing people to gradually see clearly. Not through dramatic revelations necessarily, but through repeated patterns that can no longer be ignored. The narcissist lies too often, contradicts themselves, vests too frequently, wounds too many people, creates too much confusion. At some point, those around them begin noticing that the charm and the character do not match. This is why relationships around the narcissist often begin to weaken in stages. First, emotional distance appears. People become less open, less trusting, less willing to confide in them. Then admiration starts fading. Conversations become cautious. Loyalty becomes thinner. And eventually some people leave altogether, not always loudly, but quietly, emotionally exhausted from carrying the weight of manipulation. The narcissist usually interprets this as betrayal. In their mind, they are the victim of disloyal people, jealous people, ungrateful people. What they often fail to understand is that human beings can only suppress their inner alarm systems for so long. Truth has a way of resurfacing inside the conscience. A person may ignore red flags temporarily, but eventually the soul becomes tired of living in contradiction. Tion. There is also a deeper spiritual principle at work here. Falsehood isolates, not immediately but inevitably. A person who consistently uses others rather than loves them slowly destroys the very bridge that connects human beings together. Trust. And once trust erodes, relationships may continue outwardly for appearance's sake, but inwardly they are already dying. You begin to notice something tragic in the narcissist's life over time. They may still have people around them, but fewer people genuinely know them. Fewer people truly respect them. Some remain out of fear. Others remain out of convenience. Others remain because they are still emotionally entangled. But authentic closeness becomes increasingly rare. This is part of the judgment itself. Because human beings were not created merely to be admired. They were created to be known and loved truthfully. Yet the narcissist spends so much energy protecting a false image that authentic connection becomes almost impossible. Very relationship becomes strategic. Every interaction becomes transactional. And eventually people begin sensing that they are valued only for what they provide, not for who they are. Even more fascinating is how exposure often happens without the narcissist realizing it. They believe they are controlling the narrative while their own behavior quietly reveals them. Arrogance leaks through the cracks. Cruelty becomes harder to hide. Inconsistencies accumulate. The very patterns they once concealed so carefully become visible to nearly everyone around them except themselves. And this is important to understand. Divine exposure is not always immediate destruction. Sometimes it is simply the removal of illusion. God allows the mask to weaken until truth becomes undeniable. Many people assume judgment means catastrophe. But imagine the deeper tragedy of becoming someone whom others slowly stop trusting, slowly stop admiring, slowly stop feeling safe around. Imagine reaching a point where even your closest relationships are built more on obligation than affection. That is not merely social failure. It is spiritual decay becoming visible in human form. Meanwhile, the people who once felt controlled by the narcissist often begin recovering clarity. They regain confidence. They start trusting their own perceptions again. And this threatens the narcissist profoundly because manipulation only survives where confusion exists. Once people see clearly, control weakens. In the end, relationships act almost like mirrors of the soul. They reveal what a person truly cultivates within themselves. A life built on sincerity tends to deepen connection over time. A life built on manipulation slowly destroys it. And perhaps that is one of the most sobering truths of all. Eventually, every soul is revealed by the quality of love it leaves behind. There comes a moment in the narcissist's life when the machinery of control begins to fail. And when that happens, you witness something precisely profoundly revealing, because control is not merely a habit for the narcissist, it is their psychological lifeline. It is the mechanism through which they stabilize their fragile sense of identity. They do not simply enjoy influence over others, they depend upon it emotionally. Without control, they are forced into direct contact with their own insecurity. And that is precisely the encounter they spend their lives trying to avoid. This is why narcissists often become highly skilled at shaping environments around themselves. They learn how to manipulate perceptions, dominate conversations, create emotional dependency, and maintain subtle forms of intimidation. Some use anger. Others use charm. Some use guilt, victimhood, silence, or intellectual superiority. The methods vary, but the objective remains the same. Preserve power at all costs. For a season, this can appear remarkably effective. Families revolve around them. Relationships become emotionally one-sided. Workplaces adapt themselves, elves to their moods. Entire social circles unconsciously organize around avoiding conflict with them. The narcissist mistakes this adaptation for genuine respect, when in reality much of it is fear, exhaustion, or emotional conditioning. But there is a truth woven into the structure of reality itself. Anything sustained through manipulation eventually becomes unstable. Control may produce compliance for a time, but it cannot produce peace, loyalty, or love. And eventually the strain of maintaining domination begins to crack. One of the signs that silent judgment is unfolding is that the narcissist gradually loses the ability to control outcomes the way they once did. The people they manipulated begin thinking independently. Those they intimidated begin finding courage. Former sources of admiration become emotionally detached. Situations stop bending according to the narcissist's will. At first, these changes seem small. A person begins setting boundaries. Someone stops reacting emotionally. Another refuses to participate in the usual cycle of guilt and control. The narcissist often responds with intensified tactics because they interpret resistance as a threat to survival. But what once worked effortlessly now produces diminishing results. This is deeply unsettling for them. You must understand that narcissistic control depends heavily on predictability. They rely on knowing how others will respond emotionally. Once people awaken to the manipulation, the narcissist loses their psychological leverage. And this loss of leverage creates frustration that can quickly become rage, panic, or desperation. That is why narcissists often appear most unstable precisely when they are losing control. To outsiders, it can seem irrational. They may overreact to small disagreements, become consumed with proving themselves right, or launch sudden attacks against people who are simply distancing themselves peacefully. But beneath the behavior lies a terrifying realization they cannot easily face. Their influence is weakening. And here is the deeper philosophical reality beneath all of this. Human beings were never meant to play God in the lives of others. The narcissist attempts exactly that. They attempt to define reality for everyone around them. They decide whose feelings matter, whose voice is valid, whose perception is true. In many ways, narcissistic control is an attempt to replace truth with personal power. But reality eventually resists distortion. The human spirit has an extraordinary capacity to awaken. People who once lived under manipulation begin recognizing patterns they previously excused. They rediscover their own judgment, intuition, and dignity. And once a person truly sees the dynamic clearly, fear begins losing its grip. This is why one of the greatest threats to the narcissist is not confrontation, it is clarity. Calm, grounded clarity dismantles manipulation more effectively than emotional conflict ever could. And so the Narcissi enters a painful paradox. The harder they fight to maintain control, the more obvious their instability becomes. The more aggressively they try to dominate, the more people recognize the underlying insecurity driving the behavior. Their obsession with power ultimately exposes their weakness. In many cases, they cannot comprehend why their usual strategies no longer work. They may blame society, family, betrayal, disloyalty, or envy. Rarely do they consider that perhaps they are encountering the natural consequences of living outside truth for too long. Because genuine authority flows from integrity, not intimidation. Real influence does not require constant manipulation to survive. A healthy soul does not need to crush others in order to feel secure, and perhaps this is part of God's silent judgment. allowing the narcissist to experience what life feels like when control can no longer shield them from themselves. At the center of every narcissistic struggle is the refusal to surrender. Render the illusion of supremacy. But no human being can carry that illusion forever without collapsing beneath its weight. Because the moment control becomes your god, losing control becomes your hell. Perhaps the most frightening form of judgment is not public humiliation, loss of wealth, or visible defeat. Perhaps the most frightening judgment is to slowly become a stranger to your own soul. And this is often where the narcissist eventually arrives, not in dramatic collapse at first, but in an inner world increasingly dominated by emptiness, isolation, and emotional starvation. What makes this especially tragic is that the narcissist usually spends much of life trying to avoid exactly this outcome. They pursue admiration, attention, influence, status, beauty, success, all in the hope that external validation will quiet the unrest within them. Yet the deeper problem is never external. It is spiritual and psychological. No amount of applause can heal a person who is fundamentally disconnected from truth, humility, and genuine love. Over time, something begins happening inside them that few people can see clearly from the outside. The things that once stimulated them begin losing their effect. Praise becomes temporary. Attention fades quickly. Victories feel strangely hollow. Even relationships fail to satisfy because relationships built on ego cannot nourish the soul for very long. And so the narcissist becomes increasingly restless. This restlessness is not merely boredom. It is the anxiety of a person who cannot escape themselves. They move constantly toward distraction because silence has become unbearable. Solitude becomes threatening because it removes the external noise that normally protects them from self-confrontation. In quiet moments, they are left face to face with an inner emptiness they do not know how to heal. This is why many narcissists seem perpetually dissatisfied regardless of circumstance. They may achieve goals others spend their entire lives pursuing, yet contentment remains absent. There is always another conflict, another craving, another need for validation, another emotional performance. The soul becomes like a leaking vessel that cannot stay full. And this reveals something profound about human nature. The soul was never designed to worship the self. When a person builds life entirely around ego, image, and superiority, they cut themselves off from the very things that create meaning: humility, connection, compassion, truth, and love. The result is not freedom, it is isolation. Ironically, narcissists are often surrounded by people while remaining emotionally alone. They may have conversations constantly, yet experience very little genuine intimacy. Why? Because true intimacy requires honesty. It requires vulnerability. It requires allowing another person to encounter the real self rather than the manufactured image. But for the narcissist, vulnerability feels dangerous because the false self must be protected, at all costs. So they remain trapped behind the performance, and eventually the performance becomes exhausting. You can often observe this in the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. There is tension beneath the charm, irritation beneath the confidence, weariness beneath the superiority. The narcissist may still appear socially functional, but internally they are carrying a growing psychological burden. The burden of sustaining a false identity every single day. What makes this condition even more painful is that many narcissists cannot fully recognize the source of their suffering. They search for relief externally: new admiration, new relationships, new achievements, new distractions, while the actual wound remains untouched. They attempt to cure spiritual emptiness with external stimulation, which is like trying to satisfy hunger by staring at a photograph of food. And this is where silent judgment becomes deeply visible to those paying attention. Because eventually the narcissist begins experiencing the consequences of emotional disconnection itself. Relationships feel shallow, trust becomes rare, peace disappears, joy becomes performative rather than real. They may continue chasing significance while internally feeling increasingly numb. The human soul cannot thrive without truth. That is the reality many people spend years trying to escape. A person can deceive others for a long time, but when deception becomes the foundation of identity, eventually they lose the ability to feel fully alive. They may continue existing, achieving, speaking, performing, but inwardly something essential begins dying. And perhaps this explains why some narcissists become more bitter with age rather than wiser. Instead of softening into humility, they harden into resentment, because life is no longer feeding the illusion the way it once did. Time strips away certain advantages, attention shifts elsewhere, control weakens, and without inner substance, the aging ego becomes terrified. But there is also a warning in all of this for everyone listening. The danger of narcissism exists wherever pride becomes more important than truth. Whenever image becomes more valuable than character, the soul begins drifting toward emptiness. The narcissist simply reveals this condition in its most extreme form. In the end, the greatest punishment is not losing the world. It is gaining the world while losing the ability to feel peace within yourself. Because a soul disconnected from truth may still be admired by crowds and yet remain profoundly alone.